Cities can be really expensive, especially if your job doesn't pay a lot. So today I'm going to look at the wild ways that minimum wage and affordability vary from city to city and why it matters, even if you yourself have a higher income. I'm also going to count down both the cities where you can afford the most housing on minimum wage and the least. Some of them are obvious, but most of them are super interesting, and it's all up next. This is CityNerd, weekly content on cities and transportation. Viewer suggested topics always welcome, and this is another one that came up when I was DMing with a patron. And I'm not going to read this one verbatim because that would be tedious. You can pause the video if you want, but this one really got me thinking. Because one criticism I get is that my videos tend to be from the point of view of someone who can work from home or work remotely in the city of their choice, which is a fair criticism. So I want to do something different today. And look, I've been a minimum wage worker at a couple points in my life, but working at a movie theater when you're in high school isn't the same as making minimum wage when you're an adult who has to put food on the table. And even if you yourself are not a minimum wage worker, chances are you personally depend, and your city as a whole depends, on people who are. And maybe this is a controversial idea, but I think it isn't unreasonable to expect that people should be able to live reasonably close to where they work. That's just how cities are supposed to function. First, let's acknowledge there's a whole free market argument for having a low minimum wage or no minimum wage, which is if I agree to offer a job that pays $8 an hour and someone agrees to take it, then who's to say that's wrong? And there's the argument that minimum wages are quote unquote economically inefficient and they create like deadweight loss, Google it if you have to, and that they have some unintended consequences like businesses that rely on minimum wage workers might have to close or hire fewer people. But minimum wages have some intended consequences too, and those are pretty undeniably positive. I bring these arguments up because politics are a big part of the reason why minimum wages are not the same from state to state. But also, a dollar is not going to go nearly as far in California as it does in like Alabama. And it gets even more complicated because not only do different states have different laws, different counties and municipalities within the same state sometimes have different minimum wages. First of all, let's set a baseline. The federal minimum wage is $7.25 an hour, which is where it's been since 2009, shamefully. And some states simply don't have a minimum wage, so they default to the federal minimum. Those are the gray striped states. And some states just set it at the federal level by statute. Those are the gray states. So for all those states, minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. The blue states are going to be higher, and we'll get to those as we go through the cities we're going to talk about. Okay, let's talk about what I did for the analysis today. First, I grabbed the list of 333 US cities that have a population of 100,000 or more because I needed cities where there's a decent sample size of rental price data. Next, for each city, I grabbed the corresponding minimum wage, which ranges from $7.25 for a lot of cities, all the way up to $18.69 for Seattle, and I multiplied it by 160 hours to get a rough monthly income number. That's 4 40-hour weeks. I'm not going to get into taxes, which the working poor do pay, which is asinine both morally and administratively, but I'll just fall back on the time-tested guideline that you shouldn't be spending more than 30% of your gross income, meaning before taxes, on housing. Remember, this whole exercise is just to illustrate a point about what you can afford working a full-time job. In actuality, minimum wage workers in a lot of cities probably work multiple jobs just to be able to have a chance at affording rent. So the other piece of this is housing costs in each of the 333 cities, which I got using a fresh new data set from Dwellsy, and thanks as always to them. So this will be the median rent per square foot from a snapshot of listings that was taken in October 2023. In reality, someone making minimum wage is probably not looking for a median apartment, but I still think I end up with a useful indicator, which is basically, for each city, how many square feet of the median apartment can you afford if you're working full-time at minimum wage in that city. And usually in these kinds of affordability lists, I like to talk about great urbanism, walkable places, good transit service. But today we're just gonna let the chips fall and have a look at which cities come up. So So let's get into it. Okay, first, let's count down the cities where you can afford 500 square feet of median rent, or maybe think of it as 1,000 square feet if you have a roommate who also makes minimum wage. And there are actually 12 of these cities. Peoria, Arizona, pretty great for spring training if you're a Seattle Mariners fan, which I don't really wish on anyone. Good for Padres fans too. Not the best city for urbanism, but never mind. Sold. Pueblo, Colorado. Honestly, this town would just pop if they connected up all the Front Range cities with good passenger rail. Spokane Valley, Washington. The less said, the better. Rockford, Illinois, which actually looks like a proper city, so that's a plus. Surprise, Arizona. You know, Arizona, despite having some pretty nutty politics, did manage to institute a statewide minimum wage of $13.85, which is quite a bit more than you can say for some of the more quote-unquote progressive states. And you can actually afford some cool spring training locations for teams that actually win the occasional World Series. Even less walkable than Peoria, though. Springfield, Missouri, which I think I've only ever featured on this channel to make fun of the Missouri DOT's whack interchanges. Springfield, Illinois, which made my bottom 10 state capitals, but probably would make my top 10 Springfields, just maybe not ahead of Missouri. Number 5, really the arbitrage angle on this whole list is low cost of living cities in expensive progressive states that have nice weather. And by that, I mean California, which has a statewide minimum wage of $15.50 an hour. So with that in mind, I present to you Visalia in the Central Valley. Fun fact, if you live on the north side of the freeway where the charming downtown is, you're in Congressional District 21 and you get Jim Costa out of Fresno. If you live south of the freeway, that's Congressional District 20 and you get Bakersfield's finest, Kevin McCarthy. So choose your neighborhood wisely. Columbia, Missouri, which actually rated well in my video on zip codes with affordable urbanism. And it is a college town, although I've had mixed feedback on how walkable the city as a whole is. Number 3, Elgin, Illinois, is probably my other pick out of this group. It's one of these cities that's a suburb, but only because Chicagoland kind of grew around it. Best walk score and bike score on this list of 12. And it has Metro Regional Rail service into Chicago, 20 trains on weekdays. Also, bonus points for having one of the truly bizarre public art installations on a parking garage that I've ever come across in Street View. I mean, at least I hope it's public art. Number 2, Peoria, Illinois. That's right, I gave you 2 Springfields and 2 Peorias. And number 1, the most housing you can possibly get in a city over 100,000 population at minimum wage is Buckeye, Arizona, which I hadn't even heard of before I researched this video, and which doesn't have any Cactus League ballparks, but does have a walk score of... Okay, in a minute, I'm gonna get to the 10 cities that are the least affordable on minimum wage, as well as some other bonus material. But first, quick reminder to click on all the screen elements that I'm told will increase the chances that my nonsense will show up on the home feed of unsuspecting new viewers. Connect on the apps if once a week just isn't quite enough of my terrible attitude. And direct support on Patreon really does help ensure that doing this every week does pay the bills and I don't have to go back to like consulting or something. Ugh. Okay, I didn't really look at cities under 100,000 population because this is a city-focused channel, and I just did college towns last week. But in the interest of variety, might I interest you in Vermilion, South Dakota, which in October 2023, the median available rental property is priced at 63 cents a square foot. South Dakota, unlike Pennsylvania, actually is a state that adopted a higher minimum wage, $10.80. Vermilion has a modestly charming downtown, and bonus, it is the home of the University of South Dakota. None of the preceding should be construed as professional relocation advice. Before we get to the worst of list, let's dig into a couple interesting cases. In Alabama, the city of Birmingham, which I believe has the highest housing costs in the state, did enact an increased minimum wage by city council ordinance. But the Alabama state legislature, in its infinite wisdom or sadism, passed a state law prohibiting any city from doing that. Iowa did something similar with 4 of its more progressive counties that were getting out of line. And in Kentucky, the 2 largest cities, Louisville and Lexington, passed minimum wage ordinances, but the state Supreme Court quickly ruled that they didn't have the authority to do that. Just some food for thought for anyone out there who thinks it might be a cool idea to live in a blue dot in a red state. The last interesting case I want to mention is Portland, Oregon, where the higher minimum wage applies to all jurisdictions within the urban growth boundary. So thank you, Oregon, for recognizing that this really is a regional issue and for having laws that give the Portland metropolitan region the teeth to address it. Well, except for Vancouver and the other Washington suburbs, although they actually have a higher minimum wage. Okay, let's count down the 10 least affordable cities for minimum wage workers. Cambridge, Massachusetts, which has crazy high walk and bike scores, really good transit service, and yeah, it's definitely a college town of some sort. So I'd file this one under, you kind of get what you pay for. Madison, Wisconsin, nice place to live, but the state legislature, which convenes in Madison, apparently thinks $7.25 an hour is cool. Also, not a college town, and I will not be taking questions on this. Carmel, Indiana. This is another quote-unquote city that really needs its own video. Very interesting and infuriating place. I mean, it has some of the trappings of urbanism in some spots, but man, is there any city that loves modern roundabouts more, and by the way, lower walk score than Oxford, Mississippi. Salt Lake City, $7.25 minimum wage, and housing just isn't that cheap. Number 6, Miami, Florida. $11 minimum wage, but this is a really expensive city. Although, maybe worth it just for how attractive all the people are. Number 5, Jersey City. Minimum wage is $14.13, but it's just not gonna go that far. Manchester, New Hampshire hasn't really been featured on this channel at any point that I can recall. New Hampshire is one of these states like Pennsylvania or Wisconsin that seems like it should have passed a higher minimum wage by this point, but state legislatures are wild, or general courts, or whatever New Hampshire calls it. Number 3, Charleston, South Carolina. Really a unique American city and one I'd like to feature more, but not cheap. And this is, again, the downside of being a blue dot in a red state. Number 2, Boston. Not really surprising, but what might surprise you is that there actually are no California cities in this bottom 10. San Francisco is number 16, so it's still not good, but minimum wage there is $18.07 if I'm reading it right. Still ruinously expensive. And the least affordable at minimum wage. Not a huge shocker, it's New York City, where $15 an hour gets you just a hair over 100 square feet, which coincidentally is about the size of the average New York apartment. Sorry, that joke was just sitting right there. To be fair, it is the US city where you're most likely to be able to economize on the transportation part of your monthly budget, but there are a lot of minimum wage or nearly minimum wage jobs in that city, and $15? I don't know. Okay, that is all I got. You know, I actually thought about getting into some big meta commentary on whether raising the minimum wage is even the right way to address big problems like endemic poverty or widespread income inequality. Proponents of UBI and, I don't know, advocates for the complete destruction of capitalism worldwide, come at me down in the comments. I can take it. Thanks for joining, and thanks as always to the patrons whose continued generosity ensures a continued stream of my generally pointless weekly claptrap. Keep the great topic suggestions coming. I'll be back with a new episode next week, and I'll see you then.